the quality of political leadership on the continent has declined. And that has included a reduction in the intensity of this feeling of a Pan-African feeling. For instance, if you take the decisions taken by the UN Security Council in 2011 about Libya, the African Union had taken certain positions about how to handle Libya, including no military interventions, and sent the resolution to the Security Council. A week later, Security Council went directly against that AU position. And as you know what happened there, NATO invaded, Gaddafi was killed, the Libyan state was destroyed. Directly contrary to what the African leadership had said.
I'm a king, yes.
I think as a country, we must, as a matter of policy, say that we are not looking for enemies. We must conduct a foreign policy which says we want friendly and mutually beneficial cooperation with everybody in the world. And that even if we reach a bilateral agreement with country A, we don't reach that agreement as a way of opposing another country. Yeah. So the idea that you've got to choose this one rather than that one, we can't accept that. I'm saying as a government, as a country, we need to make sure that we try and build good relations with the US, good relations with China, and good relations with everybody. There are problems, of course, as we know now, between the relations between South Africa and the United States currently. Personally, it's a matter that worries me. Because as a country, we don't need enemies. We've got too many problems for us to be nurturing enemies of any kind. As all of us know, President Trump is serving his second term as President of the United States. So as a country, we've actually got experience of our relationship with President Trump from the first term. And for 4 years, during that first term, we actually had very good relations with the Trump administration. The current relations come as a surprise to me, because you had a President Trump of that first term, and South Africa had very good relations with that administration. I'm not quite sure what has happened now. My view is that we need to have a very serious engagement with President Trump and the administration to discuss and say, what's the problem? Because the problem is new. In terms of the history of our relationship with the Republican Party, which goes over many decades, we've never faced a situation of this kind. I'm not talking about this full story about persecution of Afrikaners and all that. And bearing in mind that when we talk about President Trump, we talk about somebody who has been elected as President of the United States by a very substantial majority. We don't want to be quarreling with this majority of Americans. Hence the need for us to engage seriously about these things. It's very, very easy to explain. It would be very simple to explain to them about this fake story about the persecution of Afrikaners and so on, entirely fake. I think it would be very easy to get rid of that particular story, to show that it's not true. So that we can then get to the more substantive matter. There must be something more substantive which results in this kind of friction. the quality of political leadership on the continent has declined. And that has included a reduction in the intensity of this feeling of a Pan-African feeling. And you see its impact practically. For instance, if you take the decisions taken by the UN Security Council in 2011 about Libya, the African Union had taken certain positions about how to handle Libya, including no military interventions, and sent the resolution to the Security Council. A week later, Security Council went directly against that AU position. And as you know what happened there, NATO invaded, Gaddafi was killed, the Libyan state was destroyed. Directly contrary to what the African leadership had said. The problems of Libya are still unresolved. Africa appoints a special envoy to join these others in trying to sort out the problems in Libya. I'm talking about a specific person whose name I shall not mention, who actually abandoned that job. He walked away. And the reason he walked away was because you have all of these people who are active, from the United Nations, from the Arab League, and they would hold meetings without him. He was just an addendum there that is forgotten. Yeah. So in the end, he left. He abandoned that job. An African, a very, very important African view is ignored about an African country. And the rest of the world acts about this African country without regard to whatever these Africans are saying. It tells you something about what has happened in terms of the standing of the African continent internationally and the standing of its leadership. I think there has been a movement backwards with regard to that. It's also reflected here in this country, among ourselves. So now I'm talking about a movement backwards away from Pan-Africanism, at that engagement in the continent. I'm talking also about ourselves. I really don't know what anybody expects South Africa to do with regard to Zimbabwe. After the elections in Zimbabwe, I can't remember now the exact year, but there were elections, presidential elections, when you had something like 22 or 23 presidential candidates. What year was that? And then you have these elections, and President Mnangagwa is elected president of Zimbabwe. He then called on all of the parties which had presented presidential candidates to come together to form some kind of political collective to discuss the future of Zimbabwe. And indeed, that formation emerged. The weakness with it was that some of the parties that had candidates did not participate. One of the results of that particular presidential election was that there were two of the candidates who, between the two of them, got 95% of the votes. It's the President Emmerson Mnangagwa and Nelson Chamisa. Between the two of them, they had 95% of the presidential vote. The other 21 parties shared the other 5%. So this formation that President Mnangagwa called for, parties that had the candidates must come together. Chamisa's party did not participate, plus 1 or 2 or 3, 4 others. So, now one of the demands that is being put forward by Zimbabwe, correctly, is the lifting of sanctions that have been imposed on Zimbabwe to create better space for the Zimbabweans to address their own development challenges. Particularly in sanctions imposed by the United States. I know many of the players, political players in Zimbabwe. So I went to see President Mnangagwa to say to him, President, I agree. We need these sanctions lifted. But part of what needs to happen, is that you Zimbabweans need to speak with one voice. Our colleague also raised this question about the need for Africa to make sure that it works as a bloc, to say that you as Zimbabweans need to speak with one voice on this matter. And therefore, it seemed to me that one of the things that needs to happen is that these two parties, which had 95% of the presidential votes, need to get together to talk about the future of Zimbabwe. So that even on this matter, when we approach the rest of the world to say lift sanctions, it must be said by both. Just get together and sort out these problems. And to cut a long story short, that meeting never took place. I'm quite certain that the Zimbabweans themselves are very much aware of the fact that they need to get together as Zimbabweans to discuss whatever it is that constitute the fundamental problems facing the country. And I think indeed the Zimbabweans must be given space to do that themselves. When I've at some point spoken about some of the issues raised by some of our Afrikaner compatriots when they talk about alienation in the society, I've said the best place to discuss those matters is in the national dialogue. Instead of people going to Washington to say you are being whatever, they must come to the national dialogue and make that presentation. And so that we, as all of us as South Africans, we can then discuss that. If you say, my cultural rights as an African are being denied, say it in the national dialogue and produces evidence so that all of us as South Africans can then say, well, what is to be done? Because the answer to the question, what is to be done, will not come from Washington. It must come from here. So during the negotiations, we addressed in a very, very detailed manner this demand for a folk start. It includes, for instance, with regard to the elections in 1994, based on the 1993 Constitution, there's an agreement that part of the results of those elections would be used in order to assess whether objectively conditions exist for the establishment of a folk state. It's a specific agreement. The elections took place, and everybody agreed, including the Afrikaners, that the election results, the voice of the people of South Africa, black and white, said there's no place for a folk state. There was no way you could there was no way you could say this particular area is a folk state. The demand for Afrikaner self-determination, which was very much part of those negotiations. That matter was discussed, was negotiated, as a result of which there's actually a constitutional provision which provides for self-determination for all of the people of South Africa, not just Afrikaners. So the matter was addressed. That's what I'm saying, that if there is anybody among the Afrikaner community who still thinks there's a problem, the place to discuss us is in national dialogue. The danger with the position that is being taken, as reflected in what seems to have been said in the United States, is that you create a situation where the suggestion is the country must not undertake this task of the eradication of the legacy of colonialism and apartheid. Because if you do that, you threaten Afrikaner interests. You can't say we must not act to change the country away from that past in order to preserve what are said to be rights of the Afrikaners. You can't say that. If you take this particular group of white South Africans and they set themselves aside, they've got particular interests which must block change in South Africa. You are creating conditions of mutual hostility. The black oppressed will say, you want us to continue to live with this heritage of apartheid and colonialism, and you maintain whatever advantage you had as a result of that system. That's unsustainable. It's very, very dangerous to create a situation where there might be conflict of that kind. A national dialogue must include the possibility for these Afrikaners, like anybody else, to come and present their own case. And let us as South Africans together discuss those. If you have anybody who sits in senior positions like government, and allows himself, herself, to be captured by the private sector, to be then used by the private sector for public benefit, there's something fundamentally wrong with the politics of that person. It's somebody we should never have elected. And I think it's related to what I was raising earlier about forces opposed to the success of the democratic experiment. If you take in this instance of that state capture, the Gupta brothers, when I'm sitting at home alone, I'm saying to myself, there is something improbable about this story. To have these three brothers come out of India, they are here in this country for a few days, well, not days, a few years. But during these few years, these new arrivals are so knowledgeable about South Africa that they can establish their tentacles in such a way that they actually succeed to do the damage they did. My view is they didn't act alone. There were South Africans who were working with them in partnership. You couldn't come as a foreigner like that, and suddenly you've got access even to children. Now I'm going to take this child and promote them. How do you know this child? There were people here in South Africa who were part of that scheme.
I'm a king, yes, I'm a king, I think I'm a king,